Howdy, folks. Today we're going to continue our exploration into the rhetorical situation, what that means and how we analyze it. So, getting to our specific skills, remembering here's what we're working towards. We should be able to identify the elements of a rhetorical situation as well as to kind of describe and explain them. How do they work together? How does the writer use these? How does the writer consider these in whatever piece they're creating? So before we dive deeper into that, I want us to take a little thought and consider, when do you in your personal life use rhetoric? And I hope that you realize that you're using rhetoric in every interaction that you have, whether it's sending a tweet or writing an essay or having a deep conversation with a friend or arguing with your sister or your brother. All of those take and have a rhetorical situation in which you're choosing your words carefully based on your audience or the reason why you wanted to have this conversation, or what message is it that you're really trying to convey to that person who you posted on, I don't know, a comment on their Instagram page, even if it was just like, hey, cool picture. There's a rhetoric and there's a language that we use in our day-to-day lives, right? Obviously, how I communicate to you guys sitting in front of this microphone is going to be different than me communicating with my 1-year-old daughter and my wife and my parents and my neighbors. I might use different tools to change the way I use my rhetoric in my day-to-day life. So in a continual practice of considering this and thinking about a rhetorical situation, what I'd like for you to do is you are going to construct and then analyze, break down a rhetorical situation for me. And that situation is going to be writing a review for either a movie, an album, an app, or a restaurant. You can pick whatever it is. Let me know what movie you're writing about or what app you're reviewing or what restaurant you're talking about. And you don't actually have to write the review, right? I just want you to identify each of the 6 elements of the rhetorical situation for that particular thing, and then break it down, explain and describe what your exigence would be for writing this review. Why were you driven to choose, I want to review this movie versus this restaurant? Like, that's part of your exigence. People need to know this. And then your audience might be very different depending on what you choose, right? If you're reviewing an album, that might be very different from reviewing a restaurant, right? An album might have a very specific demographic that that artist is catering to, whereas a restaurant might be a lot broader. You might have to write, in such a way that people who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s go to this restaurant, but so do teenagers, right? There's a wide array there. So we're putting that in our free response journals. When you're done with that, we're going to explore a little bit more deeply into this idea of the rhetorical triangle, which looks at the connections between a central text and how subject and audience interact, how audience and speaker interact, and how speaker and subject interact, the connections between those things and how that truly guides what a text looks like. And remember, when I say text, I really mean anything. A text could be a painting, it could be a tweet, it could be an essay, it could be a movie. Just anything that's created is what we'll look at as our texts. And within that, everything is always in this kind of bubble of context that we should look at. So first off, let's talk about the speaker. Who is this speaker? What's their authority? What's their background? Why are they speaking about this thing in the first place? Kind of what's their exigence? And then also, what is their persona? This gets a little bit more nuanced. What face, what mask? Persona is Greek for mask. What mask are they putting forward to present this information? So one of the most famous, recognizable personas in American media within the past couple of years has been, I think, Stephen Colbert, who has played this kind of really over-the-top caricature of a person that he's not really. He does it for this satirical impact, where he's kind of leaning very sort of fundamentally right wing, but he does that in a way to kind of satirize that piece, and so he's found success in that persona. That's not really who he is, but he's using that as rhetorical technique in comedy to kind of get his point and his message across. Whether you agree with him or not, it's just an example of a persona. Another idea of a persona might be a teacher in class, right? As a teacher, I may not have a great day every day, but I try to put on this persona of optimism and confidence, even if I'm kind of having turmoil in my own personal life, or if I don't feel good. Um, I want to put on that persona for my students so they feel like they have someone who believes in them, and they know that Mr. Restad believes that I can do it, so I can do it, right? Even if I'm struggling to like stay awake, or my nose and my sinuses are clogged up because I have a cold or a flu. That would be a persona that I adopt. Additionally, we have to look at the audience, and the audience is really whoever is consuming the text. We can split that up into two groups. First is the primary audience, whoever this was intended for, right? Maybe this is a conversation between two friends. That conversation that I'm having is for that friend. That's my intended audience. Or I send an email to a parent. That's my intended audience, right? So who is this poet writing for? Is it a specific person, or is it a broader audience? Who is this journalist writing for? Who is this director directing this movie towards? Those groups may be one person, or they may be millions of people, right? That's my primary audience. But then the secondary audience would be anyone else who consumes this text. And the secondary audience can't ever be completely extracted from a writer's audience. I may have written this email to a parent, but I better be careful with what I say and how I say it, because that email might get shared with um, my principal or the student. And if I just start going off and bashing a student, that would make me a terrible teacher. But I can't just say, oh, that was just meant for the parents, because obviously anyone else who consumes that, reads that email, is part of my audience. And I would never do that, of course, but it does get people into trouble sometimes. And additionally, some other common primary and secondary audiences might be poetry. I might write a poem for a particular person, but if that gets published, anyone else who reads that is my secondary audience. So that's how one of the ways we can kind of split audience up and start to think about how does intended audience differ from secondary audience, and how do those two work together or against each other in regards to especially argument. Last one we'll take a look at is this idea of subject. Subject is just what the author or the writer is writing about, like the literal thing that is being written about, the explicit things that are in their paper or their writing or their painting. And this is not to be confused with the purpose. I would say the purpose more closely resembles the relationship between the subject. Let's go back and look at that. Purpose would be the subject, how the subject relates to the speaker. Like that would be the speaker feels strongly about the subject and their message, and here's why they are creating it. All right, so let's practice this. So pause really quick and take a look at this picture by this painting by Frida Kahlo. And we've had a good look at it to absorb all the details. We can start to analyze and break this down into a rhetorical triangle, sort of looking at this piece by piece. And so the first thing, let's take a look at the speaker, Frida Kahlo herself. So we know when it was created in the 1930s, but I also need to know something about her as an artist and her importance in the art world. And this is where, especially in understanding rhetoric, all of your other classes are going to come into play a lot. Because your own schema, your own mind map of all the things you know in the world, start getting pulled into this idea of rhetoric. So if you don't know anything about Frida Kahlo, you might struggle a little bit trying to figure out who this person is that painted this painting, right? So we have to pull on our art history knowledge. We have to pull on our historical knowledge of the Americas and Mexico and their relations. In order to really understand why and how this piece was created. So it'd be probably pretty helpful for us to know that Frida Kahlo had a particular affinity for nature and for Mexican history and heritage and culture, and that she, had experienced colonialism, saw it with her own eyes, experienced this idea of Mexicanidad after the Mexican Revolution, which was just kind of like this romantic patriotism towards her country, Mexico. All of that helps inform me in analyzing this painting. The audience is a little bit trickier to understand. Well, I can know a lot about Kahlo. It's hard for me to guess what she created this for and who she created this for. This could be, maybe as I'm looking at the details, be described as a warning to Mexico not to lose their sort of heritage. We can kind of see that it's crumbling and breaking apart in these pieces. And by contrast, America is kind of like growing and building up. And that also seems like a really good thing. But she's kind of contrasting the loss of nature and the loss of history with this idea of progress. So it's critical of America, but also maybe kind of idealizing the progress and development that America is experiencing in the 1930s. So our audience might be to Mexicans saying, pay attention to this. And it could be to Americans as well, saying, like, even though you're creating these great things, don't forget how important heritage and nature and culture is within your communities. And lastly, if I was going to try to analyze the purpose of this, I mean, its purpose is a little bit easier to understand because there's a pretty clear delineation right down the middle, comparing and contrasting Frida Kahlo's Mexico to the America that Frida Kahlo is experiencing, right? That's her purpose, is to get this point across to say these two countries, at least in my view, this is a self-portrait, are experiencing very different